The description of the Millennium Age will be explained through the war we're in. In the next century, with the Russian army stepping into Ukraine in February 2022, the drastic change in global order and the reshaping of conventional partnerships will be remembered as much as the Second World War. When we analyze the war in Ukraine in its entirety, there were many breaking moments, from the failure of the Russian army in the siege of Kiev to the liberation of Kherson by the Ukrainian armed forces. We witnessed many breaking moments. It seems that there will be a much more serious breaking moment in the coming days. A new operation that will go down in the history of the World War is about to be carried out in Crimea. The new target of Kiev, the Ukrainian armed forces, made preparations for this offensive stitched by knot in the time that has passed. The Ukrainians have carried out numerous counterattacks, flash raids through underground passages, dawn operations, and effective airstrikes on the way to the struggle for freedom, using their military resources in a planned way. Each of those plans were carried out to the smallest detail. There is now a firm belief that recapturing Crimea, Russia's last stronghold in the Ukrainian war, will end the war. This led to the start of the operation. Let's examine the Crimean operation of the Ukrainian troops marching to Crimea through Kherson, which was liberated months ago. The strategic mind games, air campaigns, and drone attacks of the Ukrainian armed forces have blockaded Ukraine's southern front lines, especially the Crimean peninsula and its surroundings. If we look at the situation on the front lines currently on the territory of Ukraine with oracle eyes, we can easily understand that the counterattacks on the Crimean peninsula and its surroundings have already started, and that the Ukrainian armed forces is among the main targets of this war. From the first days of spring in the northern hemisphere, Ukraine's Great Crimean offensive is expected to begin. Physically, we see that there is a very tight planning for this, especially British Challenger, 2 tanks, and German Leopard 2 tanks are starting to arrive on the southern fronts. In addition, the Ukrainian armed forces are forming new assault brigades made up of elite fighters to liberate Crimea. Again, the new HIMARS, Iris-T and NASAMS and their long-range missiles are on their way to be sent to Ukraine. In addition, missiles with a range of 250 kilometers and more, such as Harpoon AGM-84 and Stormy Shadow, are in the process of being sent to Ukraine for the Crimean blockade. Even though the elite assault brigades that the Ukrainian army established for the Crimean blockade are mainly land, the Ukrainian Navy is also taking action. In particular, there are dozens of underwater armed drones and unmanned armed aerial vehicles in the service of the Special Operations Forces of the Ukrainian Navy. These forces are critical for neutralizing the Russian Black Sea Navy in Crimea. The combination of all these forces is an indication that the Ukrainian armed forces can easily blockade Crimea at the first stage with approximately 80,000 soldiers, hundreds of advanced tanks, artillery systems, and hundreds of drones. However, as we have just mentioned, the Ukrainian army has created the infrastructure and rehearsal of this great offensive and blockade in the past months. The Ukrainian attacks in the skies and shores of Crimea caused great anxiety and panic among the Russian army and the Russian people in Crimea. The Kremlin and Putin learned the hard way that Crimea was now inviolable. As part of the Kiev coordinated plan for the blockade of Crimea, Ukrainian forces have carried out highly resounding offensives on the peninsula since last week. If you remember, the Crimean city of Zarkoy and the Russian military airport there were attacked by 12 Ukrainian UAVs recently. It was actually understood with this drone attack that Ukraine's Great Crimean offensive plan came into play. Then the Ukrainian forces turned their course to Sevastopol, the most important port city of Crimea. A very violent explosion occurred on the railway line in Simferopol, which is about 12 kilometers from the city. It seems that the Ukrainians were rapidly continuing their plans for the Great Crimean offensive. These latest attacks by the Ukrainian forces prove that Crimea could be a target at any time, and that there would be a possibility of Ukrainian soldiers landing on this peninsula. But Ukraine's great plan for the Crimean offensive was not limited to these attacks. Ukraine made its finishing blow by launching attacks on the city of Armyansk to create a connecting corridor between Crimea and Kherson. The geostrategic location of Armyansk provided ample opportunity for the Ukrainian army to carry out serious attacks in the planned connection corridor. According to the Ukrainian military, the Kherson region was the key to the Crimea. For this reason, in a strategic region like Armyansk, the creation of a ground attack corridor by the Ukrainian forces was among the indispensable factors for the Great Crimean Plan because the distance between Crimea and Armyansk is approximately 120 kilometers. This distance is within the effective range of Ukrainian forces' long-range missile systems such as HIMARS and GULSD. In other words, a Ukrainian missile could be the beginning of a striking offensive in Crimea at any moment. On the other hand, the recent attacks of the Ukrainians in the Dnipro Islands region to blockade the Crimean peninsula constituted one of the cornerstones of this plan. While the Kinburn spit was burning with the effect of the violent clashes between Ukraine and Russia, the Ukrainian forces were constantly conducting reconnaissance and offensive operations to keep the left bank of the Dnipro River under control and to completely expel the invading soldiers in the archipelago. The Ukrainian armed forces intended to blockade the Crimean peninsula from all sides. The fire of freedom that the Ukrainians had started in Kinburn continued to spread towards the interior of the islands. The mobilization of the Dnipro River had reactivated the Ukrainian forces. Tensions have peaked recently when Ukrainian forces destroyed a Grad multiple rocket launch system in the Kinburn region. With this last attack of the Ukrainian forces, the Kinburn spit came under fire. Following this attack on the left bank of the Dnipro River, Ukrainian forces also destroyed the missile launcher of an S-300 anti-aircraft system. The Ukrainian armed forces continued unabated and began to spread the fire of independence in Kinburn towards Nova. The Ukrainian armed forces destroyed a Russian ammunition depot, 2 reconnaissance drones, 2 mortar boats intended for use by Russian destructive military groups, an artillery radar system, a 120mm mortar, and several military trucks of the Russian army in the Novo-Kakhovka region. Yes, the Russians were now completely cornered in this region as well. The Great Crimean offensive plan of the Ukrainian army continued to work smoothly. The Crimean attacks of the Ukrainians, which created a cold shower effect in the Kremlin and left the Russian leader Vladimir Putin completely helpless, spread over a very short time. Even now, the continuation of attacks on Crimea constantly puts both the Russian administration and Russian officials and residents of the Crimean Peninsula on their toes. At present, the Russian air defense systems cannot fulfill their duty. The problems that started with the return of the S-300 defense systems to their manufacturers continue with the fact that the Ukrainian UAVs cannot be prevented. Even now, the Russians placed most of their air defense systems in Kherson and southern Ukraine in strategic centers of the peninsula to protect Crimea. But with the ingenious war tactics of the Ukrainian army, the latest drone attacks in the Crimea, the strategic centers of the Russian air defense systems have been identified. All these efforts of the Ukrainians were actually the biggest proof that Crimea would be taken back from the Russians. As the Ukrainian leader, Zelensky, stated, would the war begin in Crimea and end there? On the other hand, liberating Crimea means first making the peninsula untenable for the Russian army, navy, and air force, and then occupying it control of the already heavily damaged Kerch Bridge by Ukrainian forces and the so-called land bridge connecting Crimea to Russia via Mariupol and Melitopol, all along the coastline of the Sea of Azov, are also among the most strategic targets for occupying the peninsula. Targeting this transport infrastructure will initiate the isolation of Crimea from supply or movement. Also, a large Ukrainian armored force attacking southeast in the direction of the Sea of Azov and penetrating the Russian linear defenses will complete the isolation of Crimea and enable the closer deployment of HIMARS rocket launchers, which will then be within key range of Russian installations in Crimea. Crimea is the size of Massachusetts. Russian forces do not have many places to hide on the peninsula. The location of all Russian installations are well known, and these military installations are often in an open and vulnerable position. On the other hand, precision attacks in Sevastopol will force the Black Sea Fleet to relocate to Novorossiysk, which is much less capable as a base and is further away from Ukrainian cities. The air base in Saki on the west coast of Crimea must be completely rendered unusable, and the logistics center in Xi'an, Koi in the north of Crimea, must turn into a massive offensive fire. The damage done by war to soldiers and military equipment cannot be underestimated. As a result of the numerous wars that have continued from antiquity to the present, we have witnessed the wear and tear of the armies. Today we witness how the supply problems in the army affect the soldiers in the relentless war between Russia and Ukraine. Let's talk about the problems in the Russian army in detail. As is known, the Ukraine war is in its 13th month. Great losses on the battlefield and stress disorders related to the prolonged war bring riots. Depending on the riots, their escape from the Russian army accelerates. Finally, according to a speech deciphered by the Ukrainian intelligence unit, we learned that a detachment of soldiers from the 20th Guards Combined Army was completely destroyed and is trying to return to Russia with survivors. According to the intercepted conversation, a soldier from the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army tells one of his comrades that he is returning to Russia with the survivors of his detachment. The soldier emphasizes that he will return to Russia via Donetsk and that the Russian army no longer has any dominance in the region. His friend, speaking on the other side, emphasizes that he should hide in a basement. However, the soldier explains that the region has come under Ukrainian domination, that they will not be able to find them and that they will try to get rid of them by their own means. While the Ukrainian army was advancing, the soldier who said that the Russian command left the battlefield before them cites the cowardly commanders as responsible for the losses. The common thought of the rebelling soldiers is the irregular operation of the chain of command in the army. Let's get to know the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army, which fled the front lines. The 20th Guard, United Arms Army is a field army. This army was initially designated as the 4th Tank Army of the Soviet Land Forces, the 4th Guards Tank Army in 1945, the 4th Guards Mechanized Army in 1946, and the 20th Guards Army in 1960. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the army became part of the Russian ground forces. This army, which was a part of the Russian ground forces, came to the fore when it left the front lines. However, their escape from the front was not the first one among Russian troops. As we know, the Russian army lost 130 tanks and hundreds of soldiers in its attack on the Donetsk region. The tanks that could remain intact could not be withdrawn from the destroyed bridges and roads and fell into the hands of the Ukrainian troops. As a result, the platoon's command level stated that further progress was meaningless and stopped the operation, and their escape from the Russian army continued increasingly in the ongoing process. For example, in the past months, military training camps in Belarus were boiling like a witch's cauldron with the desertions and rebellions of Russian soldiers. While Vladimir Putin was sweating in Belarus to renew his military power, the dissatisfied Russian soldiers stood on the brink of revolt. The news that armed Russian soldiers training in Belarus escaped from a military camp fell like a bombshell. Before being released, Putin's troops were required to train on the ground of the state, which was a long-time Moscow ally. However, Russian men who do not want to risk their lives for Putin's Ukraine dream seek salvation in rebellion and desertion. Belarus had set up various barricades and checkpoints to find the fugitive armed soldiers in the Minsk region. It was announced that a group of men up to 40 years old in military uniform were sought. Russian leader Vladimir Putin passed the new law in the Russian parliament to prevent the despondent troops from leaving their posts in Ukraine due to the escapes on the front lines. As Russia continues to face heavy losses of troops, weapons, and territory in Ukraine, the country's parliament has passed new legislation designed to prevent more soldiers from leaving their posts in battlefield. The new law introduces stricter rules for soldiers and tougher penalties for those who surrender or leave the battlefield in Ukraine. According to the new law, leaving office during mobilization, martial law or war will be considered an aggravating factor and will result in more severe penalties. According to the new law, the penalties will be as follows. Soldiers face up to 10 years in prison for voluntarily surrendering and up to 15 years for looting. The new articles introduced into existing law mean that these crimes are more likely to result in maximum prison sentences when committed during martial law, mobilization, or war. According to the articles, conscientious objectors who refuse to fight when necessary can be imprisoned for up to 3 years during the war. While the losses in the Russian army and the escape from the army continue, Putin, who is looking for a way out of the current situation, is preparing to declare a general mobilization with new prohibitions and laws. The Russian army is retreating about 482 kilometers from the places it occupied. This retreat adds to the disintegration of the army. The news of the unsuccessful operation and withdrawal from the Kharkiv region increases the courage of the soldiers to not fight as the Putin administration prepares for the new general mobilization announcement. Inmates in prisons and the homeless living on the streets of Russia continue to be sources for Wagner's potential military needs. So what do we know about this Wagner group? Let's quickly review what we know. Failures on the battlefield and Ukraine's strategic attacks on the Crimean Bridge and the Black Sea Fleet prompted Russian President Vladimir Putin to continually reorganize his chain of command. These changes had little effect on the battlefield, and this was when Prigozhin's Wagner group began to act in line with its own goals. It's a mercenary group operating in the Middle East, Africa, and even South America. There are about 50,000 Wagner Group mercenaries fighting in Ukraine. Most of the fighters are convicts conscripted from prisons and penal colonies with the promise of freedom if they complete a 6-month tenure in Ukraine. But about 1 in 5 Wagner Group mercenaries is a seasoned contractor, usually with prior military experience. At the beginning of the war, the role of the private military company in the Russian operation was quite limited. But when the Russian army began to falter after several defeats on the entire battlefield, Russian President Vladimir Putin turned to his close friend, Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader and supporter of the Wagner Group. The influence and role of the private military company in the Russian operation gradually increased. The Wagner Group reached the zenith of its influence in the fight for the town of Bakhmut in Donbass. For the first time in a large-scale operation, the Kremlin turned to mercenaries to take the town, leaving the Russian army in a supporting role. Since then, the Wagner Group has led the struggle in the region, achieving some minor victories, such as the capture of the small town of Solder, north of Bakhmut, but at the cost of horrific losses. However, the Wagner Group star may soon fade as the increasingly alarmed Russian military tries to reassert its authority over the planning and conduct of war. In addition, the Russian administration does not give up trying to win alternative ways in this war, which it understands that it will lose. According to the information obtained from Ukrainian official Andriy Yermak, officials appointed by the Russians in many occupied regions tried to turn the war in their favor by holding a referendum to join Russia, according to the reports in the Russian press. These referendums aimed to protect the people of the region from Russian operations. However, Yermak interpreted this situation as an alternative solution to Putin's fear of losing the war. Departures from the Russian army continue. Putin's attitude towards his citizens and soldiers is getting tougher. Ukraine is shifting from defensive to attacking. It seems that this war, which was the beginning of the end for Russia, is about to come to an end. While withdrawing, provide Russia with the recovery desires. Will Wagner's recruitment efforts be a solution for the Russian army? Will Putin's mobilization and referendum plans work? What administrative changes will occur in a Russia that has lost the war? What kind of sanctions will the current administration or the administration that will replace it face in Russia? The Russians secured tactical gains north of Kupiansk and are developing their offensive further. They are already attacking Sinkatuka. They are preparing to open several more lines of attack to cut off a huge chunk of Ukrainian territories from supplies and collapse the front line until the Oskil River. However, there are several huge omissions in this plan that can completely ruin the Russian plan, and today I will tell you exactly what these omissions are. After weeks of continuous attacks, the Russians established control over 2 villages in the northern part of the Luhansk region. These 2 villages are located in the forest and served as a bridgehead on the other side of the river that limited the ability of the Russians to advance towards Kupiansk. The reason why it took so long for the Russians to eliminate this bridgehead lies in the disposition of Ukrainian troops. As you can see, the Ukrainians are controlling a relatively big settlement on the western bank of the Oskil River. And since the river here is extremely narrow and the Ukrainians had plenty of time to create pontoon bridges, it was very easy to supply Ukrainian troops in Dvorichna and Heronimiv or even directly launch counterattacks from across the river. Right now, the Russians are slowly clearing the area around Lyman Parish. This process turned out to be extremely time-consuming as well because the middle of the forest is densely mined, and when they get to the outskirts, they become vulnerable to local counterattacks. At first glance, it may seem strange that the Russians are not launching an attack from the east as well, and all these actions may even look like a false attack towards Kupiansk. However, the inactivity can be purely explained by the lack of proper conditions. The main reason why the Russians are so focused on reaching Kupiansk from the north is that it will diminish the Ukrainian supply and support of the Slivka group. As you might still remember, the battle for the Kupiansk group was very intense and had multiple stages because the settlements here are located at a higher elevation and create a set of synergistic defenses. That is why the Russians are not attacking them yet. They have already advanced towards Kievska, and once there are heavier engagements, as many Russian analysts are suggesting, the Russians will also open additional lines of attacks from Belshina to assault Petropavlivka. Once the troops are fixed and the area becomes an active combat zone, the Ukrainian defense in Kozlovka will start deteriorating. In fact, the Russians have significantly increased the intensity of shelling in this region. The same thing could be observed 4 to 5 days prior to Russian attacks in the forest. The Kozlovka group is bigger, so the Russians may need to spend a bit more time to soften up Ukrainian defenses. But nonetheless, it looks like the Russians expect to gradually resume their offensive actions here somewhere next week. Ukrainian analysts in turn suggest that even if the Russians turn the whole northern part into a combat zone, it will have virtually no effect on the ability of the Ukrainians to defend their positions down the line. First of all, Ukrainian positions in Kozlovka are too far from Petropavlivka to create any threat of encirclement or additional lines of attacks, which means that they will be dealing with the same type of attacks that they experienced over the last several months. Secondly, Kupiansk is not the only logistical hub in the region, as many troops and equipment get delivered to Kupiansk was Kozlovy, a town located 3 kilometers south of Kupiansk. Thirdly, there are multiple roads that connect the Kozlovka group with the secondary logistical hubs, which ensures that the Ukrainians won't just run out of ammunition and step back. The only real problem is that some Ukrainian troops will be fixed in Kupiansk, and there will be fewer available reserves in case reinforcements are needed. But this number will be proportionate to the number of soldiers that the Russians devoted their operation, which in this case should offset one another. Overall, the tactical gains that the Russians are trying to generate in the northern part of the region are too small to give the Russians an advantage in the central part of the region because they are too detached. So far it looks like the Russians are unable to achieve their announced goal, which is to recapture the Luhansk region before the rainy season. Their tempo is too slow. They have already lost thousands of troops while they tried to take these 2 villages, and there are also no indicators that they can translate tactical gains into operational. In the meantime, the Ukrainians are not losing time and rapidly preparing to retake the initiative. In spring, the first group of 635 Ukrainians have already completed general military and maneuver training, including training on a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. A second group of 710 Ukrainian troops has already begun training on the Bradleys and the M109 Paladin, and a third, the group of 890 Ukrainian troops, will begin training with Stryker combat vehicles already next week. What do you think about this? As Daily News team, we will continue to closely follow the developments in Russia and bring you the latest news. Our team spends a great deal of effort to prepare these news. You can support our team for the development of independent journalism. For this, you can use the Super Thanks button below the video. We also carefully read your comments on our news. We would like to know what you think about this incident. What do you think was the purpose of this attack? What do you think about the explosions in Russia, and how do you think this will affect the course of the war? Share your thoughts with us. Follow us for more updates.